The first time she told me she loved me, I thought she was joking. She was a woman worth millions of dollars. I was the man she paid to drive her around. I knew my place. At least I thought I did. But 3 months later, she would make a decision that could destroy her family, her reputation, and everything she had spent years building. And the strangest part? It all started with one late-night drive. My name is Daniel Brooks, and for the first few weeks I worked for Claire Whitmore, I never imagined she would become anything more than my employer. Claire was 44 years old, the CEO of a successful company, and the kind of woman whose name could open doors before she even reached them. She lived behind tall gates, traveled with security when necessary, and had people waiting for her everywhere she went. I was 38, a professional driver trying to rebuild a life that had taken a few difficult turns. Our worlds couldn't have been more different. She sat in the back seat. I sat behind the wheel. There was a clear line between us, and I had every intention of keeping it there. At first, Claire barely spoke to me. She would step into the car, carrying her phone, her handbag, and whatever problem had followed her out of the office, then spend most of the journey staring through the window or answering messages. I learned quickly that she preferred silence in the mornings and conversation late at night. I learned which coffee she liked, which routes she hated, and which radio stations she always asked me to turn off. These were ordinary details, the kind a good driver remembers without thinking. What I didn't understand was why. Little by little, she was beginning to remember things about me too. She asked about my family. She asked where I grew up. She wanted to know why I had chosen professional driving when I seemed to have other ambitions. At first, I gave her simple answers. I didn't want to become too familiar with my employer. But Claire kept asking. Sometimes she would tell me to take the longer route home, even when there was no traffic. Sometimes she would ask me to stop somewhere quiet and simply sit in the car for another 20 minutes. I told myself she was tired. I told myself she needed someone to talk to. I never considered the possibility that she was beginning to look forward to being alone with me. Then came the night that changed everything. It was close to midnight when Claire called me and asked me to pick her up. Her voice sounded different. Not angry, not tired, frightened. She gave me an address I'd never heard before and told me not to tell anyone where we were going. When I arrived, she was standing beneath a streetlight with no assistant, no security, and none of the confidence I had seen during the day. She opened the door, got into the back seat, and stared at me through the mirror. Then she said only 2 words. "Drive, Daniel." I didn't ask questions. I pulled away from the curb. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The city passed outside the windows while Claire sat, unusually still behind me. Then my phone rang. It was a number connected to her household. I answered, and the person on the other end asked where Claire was. Before I could respond, Claire quietly shook her head. I understood. She didn't want me to tell them. So elite. And that was the first boundary I crossed for Claire Whitmore. What I didn't know was that the lie would eventually pull me into a world of family secrets, money, betrayal, and a relationship neither of us had planned. Because that night wasn't simply the beginning of a romance. It was the beginning of a secret that would put everything Claire had built at risk. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The next morning, Claire acted as though nothing had happened. She walked out of her house wearing an expensive suit, carrying a coffee in one hand and her phone in the other. She looked exactly like the woman I had driven around for weeks. Calm, controlled, untouchable. But when she opened the car door and looked at me, there was something different in her expression. It lasted only a second, but I noticed it. She knew I had kept her secret. And from that moment forward, something between us began to change. The problem was, neither of us knew where that change would lead. For the first few weeks, I made a point of remembering exactly what I was to Claire Whitmore. I was her driver. Nothing more. I wasn't her friend, her confidant, or someone who belonged in her private world. My job was simple. I picked her up, took her where she needed to go, waited when she needed me, and brought her home. That was the arrangement, and I respected it. Claire was 44, a successful businesswoman who had spent years building a company worth millions of dollars. I was 38, living a much simpler life and working long hours because I needed the income. Our differences were obvious every time she stepped into the back seat of that black sedan. She had a world of wealth waiting for her beyond the windows. I had a steering wheel, a paycheck, and a growing feeling that there was much more going on in her life than she wanted anyone to know. Before Claire hired me, I had spent several years driving for different clients around the city. I had learned that wealthy people could be difficult, demanding, and sometimes completely detached from the people working around them. So when I received the offer to become Claire's private driver, I expected the same thing. The salary was far better than what I had been earning, and the schedule was demanding but manageable. I accepted immediately. During my first meeting with Claire, she didn't ask me about my driving record or spend much time discussing the job. Her assistant had already handled most of that. Instead, Claire looked directly at me and asked one question. "Can I trust you?" I remember thinking it was an unusual question for an employer to ask during a first meeting. I told her yes. She studied my face for a moment before saying, "Good. That's all I need to know." Claire's routine was remarkably consistent. Every morning, I arrived at her home at nearly the same time. She would come out a few minutes later, usually already taking a phone call. Some mornings she was discussing business deals worth millions. Other mornings she was dealing with family matters. I quickly learned that she disliked being late and hated unnecessary conversation before 9 in the morning. So I gave her space. I kept the vehicle clean, learned her preferred routes, and paid attention to the small details that made the job easier. If she had an important meeting, I made sure she arrived early. If she had a long day, I kept the drive quiet. I never asked personal questions. I believed professionalism meant knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. What I didn't realize was that my silence was one of the first things that made Claire comfortable around me. Within a few weeks, she started noticing things about me. One morning, she looked at me through the rearview mirror and asked, "Daniel, do you always listen to old music?" I smiled and told her I did. She laughed and said she couldn't understand why someone my age listened to songs her parents used to play. It was the first genuinely casual conversation we'd had. After that, little conversations became normal. She asked about my favorite food, where I grew up, and whether I had always wanted to be a driver. I answered politely, but I kept reminding myself that she was my employer. Whenever the conversation became too personal, I redirected it. Claire noticed. One afternoon, she suddenly asked, "Why do you always change the subject when I ask about you?" I told her there wasn't much interesting to say. She smiled and replied, "I don't believe that." The strange thing was that Claire seemed to enjoy the time we spent together more than she wanted to admit. Her schedule was packed with meetings, dinners, flights, and business appointments. But whenever she had the choice between taking a shorter route or sitting in traffic on a longer one, she sometimes chose the longer route. At first, I assumed it was because she wanted to make phone calls without interruptions. Then one evening, she surprised me. We were almost at her house when she said, "Keep driving." I asked where she wanted to go. She said she didn't know. I continued down the road. 10 minutes became 20. 20 became nearly 40. Eventually, she asked me to pull over near a quiet park. She stayed in the back seat and looked through the window. I didn't ask what was wrong. After a while, she quietly said, "I just don't want to go home yet." That sentence stayed with me. Claire had everything most people dreamed about. A beautiful home, a successful company, financial security, people who answered her calls immediately. Yet she had just admitted that she sometimes didn't want to return to the life she had built. I didn't know why, and I didn't ask. Instead, I simply sat behind the wheel and gave her the silence she seemed to need. After several minutes, she asked me about my life. This time, I answered honestly. I told her that I had once wanted to start my own transportation company, but had been forced to abandon the idea after a series of financial setbacks. I told her that driving had started as temporary work, but had eventually become my career. Claire listened carefully. Then she said something I wasn't expecting. You shouldn't give up on that dream. I looked at her through the mirror. She wasn't speaking like a wealthy employer anymore. She sounded like someone who genuinely believed in me. From that night forward, our conversations became deeper. Claire started telling me things about herself that I had never expected to hear. She told me about the pressure of running a company that everyone assumed could never fail. She talked about her father, a man whose approval she had spent years trying to earn. She mentioned her failed marriage and how difficult it was to know whether people genuinely cared about her or simply cared about what she could provide. I listened. I didn't offer solutions unless she asked. Perhaps that was why she kept talking. Most people around Claire wanted something from her. Her employees wanted decisions. Her business partners wanted agreements. Her family wanted influence. I wanted nothing except to do my job properly. But that difference slowly became important. Then I started noticing something else. Claire had begun receiving phone calls that changed her mood instantly. She would answer confidently, then become quiet. Sometimes she would tell the caller she was busy. Other times she would simply hang up. One afternoon, after ending a call, she stared at her phone for several seconds before placing it face down. I asked if everything was okay. She looked at me through the mirror and said, "Everything is fine," but her voice told me otherwise. I didn't press her. A few minutes later, she asked me to take a different route home. I followed the instruction. As we drove, she suddenly asked, "Daniel, if someone asked you where I was tonight, what would you say?" I thought she was joking. I smiled and said, "I'd tell them the truth." Claire didn't smile back. She said, "Even if I asked you not to." That was the moment I realized the woman sitting behind me was keeping something much bigger than ordinary family problems. I didn't know who was calling her. I didn't know why she was afraid of being seen in certain places. And I certainly didn't know why she had started trusting me with pieces of her private life. But I could feel the distance between employer and employee becoming smaller. That should have been a warning. Instead, I thought I could handle it. I thought boundaries were easy to maintain as long as I remembered who was paying whom. I was wrong. 3 days later, Claire asked me to pick her up from a private meeting after 10 at night. When I arrived, she was standing alone outside a building, looking over her shoulder as if she expected someone to appear. She entered the car without saying a word. I asked if she wanted to go home. She shook her head. Then she gave me an address on the other side of the city. As we pulled away, she looked through the rearview mirror and said, I drove without asking another question. Claire had given me an address on the opposite side of the city, and for the next 20 minutes, the only sound inside the car was the quiet hum of the engine. She sat behind me, looking through the window, occasionally checking her phone. Several times, the screen lit up with incoming calls, but she refused to answer. Finally, she turned the phone completely off. I glanced at her through the mirror and saw something I had never seen before. Fear, not the kind that disappears after a difficult conversation, but the kind that makes a person question everyone around them. When we reached the address, Claire asked me to wait. She stepped out, walked toward a small office building, and disappeared through the entrance. I had no idea what she was doing there. Almost 40 minutes later, she returned carrying a thin folder. She got into the car and whispered, "Take me home." On the drive back, Claire didn't explain anything. I didn't ask, but when we reached her neighborhood, she surprised me by asking me to stop several blocks away from her house. She remained seated, staring at the folder in her hands. Then she said, "Daniel, have you ever trusted someone and later discovered you never really knew them?" I told her I had. She asked what happened. I said that sometimes people show you exactly what they want you to see until they no longer have a reason to hide the truth. Claire looked at me for several seconds. Then she said, "That's what I'm afraid of." She opened the folder slightly, looked at the papers inside, and closed it again. Whatever she had discovered was important enough to keep her awake at night, but she still wasn't ready to tell me. Before leaving the vehicle, she turned around and said, "Thank you for not asking questions." The following morning, Claire behaved as though nothing unusual had happened. She walked out of her house wearing a dark blue suit and carrying her usual coffee. She greeted me with a simple good morning and got into the car. For a moment, I wondered whether I had imagined the entire night before. But then she leaned forward slightly and said, "About yesterday, forget everything you saw." I told her I understood. She nodded and leaned back. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it became the beginning of something neither of us expected. Over the next several days, Claire became more comfortable around me. She began asking me about my plans for the future. She wanted to know whether I still dreamed of opening my own transportation company. When I told her I did, she asked how much money I would need to get started. I immediately told her I wasn't asking her for anything. She smiled and said, "I know." There was something different about the way Claire looked at me now. It wasn't obvious enough to accuse her of anything, but it was there. She would sometimes sit in the front passenger seat instead of the back, especially during shorter trips. She started choosing the music herself and occasionally laughed at things I said. One morning, she arrived late and found me eating a sandwich while waiting for her. She looked at the sandwich, looked at me, and said, "You know, most people would have waited." I told her I had been waiting for nearly an hour. She laughed and said, "Fair enough." Then she surprised me by asking if I wanted breakfast. We stopped at a small restaurant before her first meeting. For almost 40 minutes, we sat across from each other like two ordinary people. No assistants, no employees, no expensive office. Just Claire and Daniel having breakfast. When the bill arrived, she reached for it. I stopped her. She smiled and said, "You're stubborn." I replied, "You noticed." From that morning onward, the line between our professional relationship and our personal connection became harder to see. Claire started telling me about her childhood. She told me her father had been a demanding man who believed success was the only measure of a person's worth. She had spent years trying to prove herself to him. Even after building her own company, she still felt as though she was waiting for him to say she had finally done enough. She told me about her marriage, too. Her former husband had been charming when they met, but after their wedding, she realized he was more interested in her wealth than in the woman behind it. She said she had spent years wondering whether anyone would ever choose her if she had nothing to offer. I didn't know how to respond, so I simply told her that money couldn't make someone genuinely care. She looked at me and asked, "How do you know?" I said, "Because if money could buy love, you wouldn't be sitting here wondering about it." Claire didn't say anything after that. She simply looked out the window, but I noticed a small smile on her face. The late-night drives became more frequent. Sometimes she would ask me to take the long way home. Other times, she would ask me to stop somewhere quiet so she could talk. One evening, she asked me to drive along the waterfront. The city lights reflected across the dark water as she sat quietly behind me. After several minutes, she said, "Do you ever wonder what your life would look like if you had made one different decision?" I told her I did. She asked which decision. I said there were too many to choose from. She laughed softly. Then she said, "I think about it all the time." I asked what she would change. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned forward and said, "Maybe I would have learned earlier that having everything doesn't mean you have someone to share it with." I looked at her through the mirror. She was already looking at me. That moment made me uncomfortable because I understood what she was implying. I reminded myself that she was my employer. I told myself that whatever connection was developing between us couldn't be allowed to become something else. Claire seemed to understand that too. For several days afterward, she became more distant. She returned to sitting in the back seat. She stopped asking personal questions. Our conversations became professional again. I thought perhaps the strange tension had passed. I was relieved. Then one evening, she surprised me by asking me to wait outside a restaurant. She had a business dinner scheduled for an hour. Nearly 3 hours later, she finally came outside. She looked exhausted. She opened the car door and sat down without speaking. I asked if she wanted to go home. She said yes. We drove for several minutes before she suddenly asked, "Do you think I'm a difficult person to love?" I didn't answer immediately because I knew there was only one honest answer. I told her I didn't think she was difficult to love. I thought she was difficult to understand because she rarely allowed anyone close enough to know her. Claire became completely silent. Then she said, "You're the first person who has ever said that to me." I told her I was only being honest. She looked out the window again, and for the rest of the journey, neither of us spoke. When we arrived at her home, she didn't immediately leave the vehicle. She remained seated for almost a minute. Then she looked directly at me and said, "Daniel, I don't think you're just my driver anymore." My heart began beating faster. I asked her what she meant. She opened the door, stepped outside, and said, "That's exactly what scares me." The next morning, everything changed again. Claire's older brother, Richard Whitmore, was waiting outside her home when I arrived. I had seen him only once before, but I immediately recognized him. He was in his late 40s, confident, well-dressed, and clearly accustomed to getting answers. He watched me closely as I pulled the vehicle to the curb. Claire came outside and noticed him. Her expression changed immediately. Richard walked toward her and said something I couldn't hear. Claire responded sharply. Their conversation lasted less than a minute before Richard looked directly at me. His expression told me he had already noticed the growing closeness between us. As Claire entered the vehicle, she told me to leave. We drove away in silence. After several minutes, she finally said, "My brother doesn't trust you." I asked why. She replied, "Because he doesn't trust anyone who gets close to me." Then she added something that made me realize the situation was much more complicated than I had imagined. "Daniel, I need you to be careful around my family." For the first time since I started working for Claire Whitmore, I realized that the problem wasn't simply that her family didn't like me. There was something deeper happening around her, something she had been trying to keep away from me. Richard's warning had made that clear, but I still didn't understand why Claire seemed frightened whenever her family came up in conversation. She spent the entire drive staring through the window, barely saying a word. Finally, I asked her if she wanted me to stop working for her. She immediately turned toward me and said, "No." Her answer came so quickly that I almost laughed. She then lowered her voice and said, "If you leave now, they'll know something is wrong." I asked who she meant by that. Claire didn't answer. Instead, she told me to keep driving. That was becoming a familiar request, but this time there was something different in her voice. She wasn't looking for another quiet drive. She was trying to stay ahead of something. For the next several days, Claire became increasingly cautious. She stopped discussing business in the car. She changed her usual routes and occasionally asked me to drive past her destination before turning around. Once, she asked me to park several streets away from her office and wait while she walked the rest of the distance. I began to wonder whether someone was following her. When I finally asked, she said I was imagining things. But that same evening, while waiting outside her office, I noticed a dark SUV parked across the street. It remained there for nearly an hour. When Claire finally came out, the SUV pulled away at almost exactly the same moment. I mentioned it to her. She looked through the rear window and immediately became silent. Then she told me to drive to a place she had never asked me to visit before. It was a quiet hotel on the edge of the city. When we arrived, she didn't get out. She simply sat in the back seat and said, "I think someone is watching me." That was the first time Claire admitted that she was afraid. She explained that several months earlier, she had discovered irregularities in her company's finances. Money had been moving through accounts she didn't recognize, and certain transactions had been approved using authorization that appeared to come from her office. At first, she assumed it was an accounting mistake, but after her financial team investigated, they found more unexplained payments. Claire had quietly started looking into the matter herself because she didn't know who she could trust. Then she discovered that someone had accessed private information about her personal accounts. She believed the person responsible had connections inside the company. I asked why she hadn't contacted the police. She said she needed proof first. If she accused the wrong person, she could destroy her company and damage the reputation she had spent decades building. But there was another reason she was frightened. Some of the missing money had been transferred shortly before major business decisions were made, which made it look as though someone wanted her to take responsibility. Claire handed me a small folder. Inside were copies of financial records, emails, and handwritten notes. I didn't understand everything I was looking at, but one detail immediately caught my attention. Several transactions had been approved on days when Claire had been out of the country. Someone had used her authority while she was away. She told me she had confronted one of her senior executives, but the man denied everything. She then confronted another person and received the same response. Eventually, she realized the person responsible might be someone who knew her movements well enough to know when she wouldn't be able to respond quickly. That was when I understood why she had become so careful about where she went and who knew her schedule. She didn't know who was watching her. And now, because I was the person driving her everywhere, I had unknowingly become part of the situation. I asked Claire whether Richard knew about the investigation. She hesitated. Then she said yes. Her brother knew something was wrong, but she didn't trust him with everything. Richard had been pressuring her to sell a portion of the company for months. Claire refused because she believed the business was worth far more than the offer. Their disagreements had become so serious that she had started keeping certain information from him. I asked whether she believed Richard was responsible. Claire shook her head. "I don't know," she said. "That's the problem." She told me that Richard had access to certain financial information, but she couldn't prove he had done anything illegal. She also said there were people inside the company who had far more access than he did. The more she explained, the more complicated everything became. I suddenly understood why she had asked me not to tell anyone where I took her. She wasn't simply hiding from her family. She was trying to determine who she could trust. That night, Claire asked me to take her home, but before we reached the house, she asked me to stop near a quiet street. She sat there for several minutes without speaking. Then she looked at me and said, "Daniel, I need to tell you something." I waited. She told me that when she first hired me, she had checked my background carefully. She had needed someone trustworthy because her previous driver had resigned suddenly after refusing to answer questions about her movements. Claire had wanted someone who would follow instructions without selling information about her to other people. She admitted that she had initially seen me only as a professional employee, but over time that changed. She told me she began looking forward to our conversations. She started noticing when I wasn't around. She liked how I listened without judging her. And she realized she had become emotionally attached to the one person she never expected to become important to her. I didn't know how to respond. I had spent weeks telling myself that the connection between us was nothing more than friendship. But hearing Claire say those words made it impossible to pretend anymore. I reminded her that she was my employer. She said she knew. I told her that people would talk. She said she knew that too. I told her that our lives were completely different. She looked at me and said, "I know." Then she asked me the question that changed everything. "Daniel, if I wasn't your employer, would you still want to be around me?" I couldn't answer immediately. I thought about every late-night drive, every conversation, every time she had trusted me with something she couldn't tell anyone else. Finally, I told her the truth. "Yes." Claire looked down, took a deep breath, and whispered, "That's what I was afraid of." The next week became the most confusing period of my life. Claire and I tried to create distance between us, but every attempt seemed to bring us closer. She returned to the back seat and kept our conversations professional, but the silence felt different now. We both knew there were feelings neither of us had acknowledged openly. Then one evening, after an especially difficult meeting, Claire entered the vehicle and immediately asked me to take her somewhere quiet. I drove until we reached the waterfront. She got out and stood beside the car, staring at the city lights. I joined her. For several minutes, neither of us said anything. Then she told me she was tired of pretending. She said she had spent her entire life protecting herself because she believed people only wanted access to her money and influence. But I had never asked her for anything. I had never treated her differently because of what she owned. And somewhere along the way, she had stopped seeing me as her driver. Then Claire finally said it. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Daniel." I stood there completely stunned. I had imagined those words in some distant, impossible scenario, but hearing them in reality was different. I told her she couldn't say something like that without understanding what it could cost her. She said she understood. Her family could object. Her employees could gossip. Her business reputation could suffer. People could accuse me of using her. People could accuse her of abusing her position. But none of that changed how she felt. I asked her whether she was certain. She looked directly at me and said, for several seconds after Claire told me that someone knew about us, neither of us spoke. I kept my eyes on the road, but my mind was racing. I had spent the last several months believing our biggest problem was the difference between our lives. She was wealthy. I was her employee. Her family would never understand. People would make assumptions. But now I realized we had a much bigger problem. Someone had discovered our relationship, and judging from the fear on Claire's face, that person wasn't interested in simply embarrassing her. I asked what had been sent to her phone. She refused to answer at first. Then she slowly turned the screen toward me. It was a photograph of us. Claire and I were standing together near the waterfront from the night she had confessed her feelings. The picture had been taken from a distance. Neither of us had noticed anyone watching. Beneath the photograph was a message containing only 6 words. You should know who you're protecting. Claire immediately locked her phone. I asked who could have taken the photograph. She said she didn't know. Then another message arrived. This time, it contained a photograph of documents from her company. I recognized the folder she had shown me weeks earlier. Someone had photographed the evidence she had been collecting. That meant whoever was contacting her knew about the financial investigation. Claire's breathing became heavier. She told me that if the wrong person had access to those documents, everything could collapse. I asked whether she believed the person behind the messages was connected to the missing money. She said she didn't know, but she had a strong suspicion. Then she looked at me and said, "There's something I never told you." I waited. She explained that before she hired me, someone had been leaking information about her schedule. Meetings she had planned privately were somehow reaching people outside the company. She had replaced several employees, changed security procedures, and even stopped sharing certain details with her family. Nothing had worked. That revelation made me question everything. I asked Claire why she had never told me that when we first met. She said she didn't want to frighten me away. I asked whether that was the only reason. She hesitated. Then she admitted that she had initially investigated me before hiring me. She had checked my employment history, financial situation, references, and personal background. She wanted to make sure I wasn't connected to anyone who might be trying to gain access to her life. Hearing that made me uncomfortable. I reminded her that I had trusted her from the beginning. She said she knew, but I asked the question that had been bothering me for weeks. Did you hire me because you needed a driver? Or because you needed someone you could use? Claire immediately told me that wasn't what happened, but I wasn't satisfied. I needed to know whether our relationship had started because she genuinely liked me or because I had simply become useful to her. Claire asked me to pull over. We stopped outside a quiet building, and she turned toward me. She told me that when she first met me, she saw an employee who appeared trustworthy. Nothing more. But after the first few weeks, she began noticing things she hadn't expected. I never tried to impress her. I never asked about her money. I never mentioned wanting to work for her company. I never treated her like someone above me. She said that was exactly what made her comfortable. Eventually, she stopped thinking of me as the man she hired and started thinking about me when I wasn't there. She admitted that she had been fighting those feelings because she knew how complicated the situation was. If I could go back, she said, I would still hire you. But I would try very hard not to fall in love with you. I looked at her and said, "And did that work?" She smiled sadly. "You already know the answer." The following morning, I decided to resign. I told myself it was the responsible thing to do. If I remained Claire's driver, every accusation against us would be easier for people to make. Her family could claim I was manipulating her. Her business competitors could claim I was trying to gain access to her wealth. Even Claire's employees could question whether her decisions were influenced by our relationship. I told her that leaving was the best way to protect both of us. She became angry. She said I was making the decision for her. I told her I wasn't trying to abandon her. I was trying to remove myself from a situation that was becoming dangerous. Claire looked at me for a long moment and said, "Daniel, you think walking away will make this disappear? It won't. Whoever is doing this already knows about us." I asked what she wanted me to do. Her answer was simple: stay. That evening, Claire showed me something she had discovered. It was a series of financial records connecting several suspicious payments to a consulting company. The company appeared legitimate, but its ownership was hidden behind several layers of other businesses. Claire believed someone inside her organization had been using the consulting company to move money out of the business. But when she followed the records further, she found something that shocked her. One of the people connected to the company had previously worked closely with her former husband. Claire had never mentioned this because she had been afraid that revealing the connection would cause a family scandal before she had enough evidence. I asked whether her former husband could be involved. She said she didn't know. They had been divorced for years, but he still had contacts within certain business circles. Then Claire looked at me and said, "There's one more thing you need to see." She opened another file. My name was inside it. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood what I was seeing. My name appeared on a document connected to the investigation. Claire immediately explained that it wasn't evidence against me. Someone had been researching me. They had collected information about where I lived, where I worked before Claire hired me, and even the financial problems I had experienced years earlier. Whoever was behind the investigation had apparently discovered my old business plans and knew I had once wanted to start a transportation company. I asked Claire why anyone would care about me. She said that was exactly what frightened her. They might be trying to create the appearance that I had approached her because of her wealth. If they could make it look like our relationship had been planned, they could destroy both our reputations without ever needing to prove a crime. I felt betrayed, not by Claire, but by the realization that someone had been watching me too. Suddenly, every late-night drive felt different. Every unfamiliar vehicle seemed suspicious. Every phone call Claire received carried new meaning. I asked her whether she knew who was behind it. She shook her head, but then she said something that changed the direction of the investigation. She had discovered that the person sending the messages had access to information that only a handful of people knew. Someone close to her was giving them information. Claire had suspected her brother Richard, but she wasn't convinced. Richard had motives to pressure her, but there was no direct evidence connecting him to the financial records. She believed someone else might be using the conflict between them to make him look guilty. That night, we decided to meet someone Claire trusted. She gave me an address and asked me to drive there alone first. I arrived at the location and waited. 10 minutes later, Claire appeared. She had brought a former employee who had worked in her financial department. The woman explained that she had noticed unusual transactions months earlier, but had been afraid to report them. She had saved copies of several records before leaving the company. Those records revealed something neither Claire nor I had expected. The money wasn't simply disappearing. It was being moved immediately before certain company decisions were made, suggesting someone was deliberately creating financial pressure. The person responsible wanted Claire to believe the company was in trouble. If she became desperate enough, she might sell part of the business. And if the right buyer appeared at the right time, someone could make an enormous profit. Then the former employee revealed the name of the company that had repeatedly offered to buy Claire's shares. It was connected to someone Claire trusted, someone who had been around her for years. Someone who knew her schedule. Someone who knew about her relationship with me. Claire looked at the documents and went completely silent. She finally understood why someone had wanted her distracted, frightened, and isolated. This wasn't only about money. It was about control. And if the person behind it discovered that Claire had the evidence, they could no longer afford to wait. We left the meeting separately. Claire asked me to take her home, but halfway there, her phone rang. She answered and listened without saying a word. Then she ended the call and stared straight ahead. I asked who it was. She whispered, "Richard." I asked what he wanted. Claire's voice trembled as she said, "He knows we've been investigating the company." I asked how he found out. She looked at me and said, "Because someone inside my own family has been talking." When we reached her house, Richard was waiting outside. He wasn't alone. Two security officers stood near the entrance. Claire got out of the car and walked toward him. I stayed behind the wheel, watching through the windshield. Richard said something to her that I couldn't hear. Claire immediately turned around and came back toward the car. She opened the door and sat beside me instead of taking her usual place in the back. Then she said, "Don't go home tonight." I asked why. She looked toward the house and whispered, "Because I don't think it's safe." For the first time, I realized the woman I had fallen in love with wasn't simply fighting to save her company. She was fighting to discover who she could trust before it was too late. I didn't go home that night. I drove Claire to a quiet hotel outside the city, using a route neither of us normally took. She sat beside me in the front passenger seat, not in the back where she had spent months sitting while I drove her from one meeting to another. Neither of us said much. Everything had changed. The woman who had once been my employer was now someone whose safety I felt responsible for. But more importantly, I had finally understood that what existed between us wasn't simply the result of spending too many hours together. Somewhere between the late-night conversations, the secrets, the arguments, and the moments when Claire allowed herself to be vulnerable, something real had developed. When we reached the hotel, Claire looked at me and said, "Daniel, if this ends badly, I don't want you blaming yourself." I told her I wasn't going anywhere. She smiled and said, "That's what I'm afraid of." Then she reached across the space between us and held my hand. The next morning, Claire contacted the former financial employee who had helped us. She had discovered one final piece of information. The suspicious consulting company wasn't directly controlled by Richard, Claire's former husband, or any of the people we had initially suspected. It was connected to a senior executive inside Claire's company named Thomas Reed. Thomas had worked beside Claire for almost 8 years. He knew her schedule, her business decisions, her financial arrangements, and the people she trusted. He had also been one of the strongest voices encouraging Claire to sell part of the company. The evidence suggested that he had been secretly moving money through outside companies while creating the appearance that Claire's business was struggling. His plan was simple: make Claire believe she was losing control, convince her to sell, then allow a group connected to him to purchase the undervalued company. But there was one problem. Claire had started asking questions before he was ready. We arranged for the evidence to be reviewed by an independent legal team. Claire didn't confront Thomas immediately because she knew that one careless move could give him time to destroy the remaining evidence. Instead, she returned to work as though nothing had happened. She attended meetings, answered questions, and behaved exactly as she always had. I continued driving her, but our relationship had changed completely. There were no more assumptions about what we were. We had finally admitted that we loved each other. Yet we also understood that the timing couldn't have been worse. Claire's family was suspicious, her company was under threat, and someone had been monitoring us. Still, there were moments when the pressure disappeared. One evening, after a long day, Claire sat in the front seat and laughed about something I had said. She looked at me and said, "Do you remember when I thought you were just going to be my driver?" I smiled and told her, "I remember." She replied, "I was wrong." The evidence was eventually presented to the authorities and to the company's independent board. Thomas was confronted with records showing the movement of money, communications with outside companies, and evidence that confidential information had been shared without authorization. At first, he denied everything. Then the investigators presented information from a device connected to one of the accounts. The evidence showed that Thomas had been coordinating with people outside the company for months. He had also been responsible for several messages sent to Claire. He had discovered her relationship with me and deliberately used it to frighten her. He wanted Claire distracted and isolated while the financial scheme continued. He had even provided information about my background to make it appear that I had approached Claire for financial reasons. When the truth finally came out, Claire realized why someone had worked so hard to make her doubt everyone around her. The goal wasn't simply to steal money. It was to make her doubt herself. Richard's role was different. He had been angry with Claire and had pressured her to sell part of the company, but he hadn't been responsible for the fraud. He had known something was wrong, but had made the mistake of trying to handle it privately. When he learned how far the situation had gone, he finally admitted that his behavior had made everything worse. Claire wasn't immediately ready to forgive him. Their relationship had been damaged by years of arguments, competition, and mistrust. But for the first time, Richard apologized without asking for anything in return. He told his sister that he had spent so many years trying to protect the family that he had forgotten to listen to her. Claire didn't answer immediately. She simply nodded. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a beginning. When the investigation was over, Claire's company survived. The people responsible faced serious consequences, and the financial damage was contained. Her reputation remained intact, but her life had changed. She no longer trusted people simply because they had known her for years. She became more careful about who she allowed into her private world. And she also realized something she had spent most of her life avoiding. Money could give her security, but it couldn't tell her who genuinely cared about her. She had spent years surrounded by people who knew her position, her wealth, and her influence. Yet the person who had eventually become closest to her was the man who had initially known almost nothing about her except where she wanted to go. But there was still one decision Claire had to make. I had been thinking about resigning ever since the investigation began. Even after everything was resolved, I believed it was the right thing to do. I told Claire that I couldn't continue being her employee if we were going to have a real relationship. She understood. The next morning, I arrived at her house for the final time as her driver. I parked the car outside and waited. Claire came through the front door, carrying a small box. She walked toward me and handed me the keys. I looked at her, confused. She smiled and said, "You're not driving me anymore." I asked what she meant. She said she had already arranged for another driver. I thought she was ending our relationship. Then she stepped closer and said, "You don't work for me anymore, Daniel." She paused, and that's exactly how I wanted. I asked what she expected me to do next. She told me she wanted me to finally pursue the business I had once given up on. She had no intention of giving me money or buying my future for me. Instead, she had something else in mind. She had spoken to a business advisor who helped me understand what I would need to start a legitimate transportation company. I was stunned. I told her I didn't want her to build my life for me. She smiled and said she wasn't trying to. She simply wanted me to have the chance to build it myself. For the first time since I had known her, there was no employer and employee between us. There was simply Claire and Daniel, two people who had met under completely unexpected circumstances and somehow found something neither of them had been looking for. Months later, I started my transportation business. It was small at first. One vehicle became two. Two became four. It wasn't an overnight success, and Claire never treated it like one. She encouraged me, but she never tried to control it. She remained successful in her own career, while I slowly built something that belonged entirely to me. Our relationship became less complicated because we no longer had to worry about what people would say about an employer and an employee. We were simply two adults trying to create a life together. And sometimes, when Claire had a long day, she would still call me and ask if I could pick her up. I would laugh and remind her that she had another driver now. She would answer, "I know. I just prefer you." There was one evening, almost a year after everything happened, when Claire asked me to meet her at the same waterfront where she had first admitted that she was falling in love with me. We stood beside the water, watching the city lights reflect across the surface. She reminded me of that first night and asked whether I had ever imagined where our story would lead. I told her honestly that I hadn't. She smiled and said she hadn't either. Then she asked me something I never expected. "Do you remember what you were when we first met?" I laughed and said, "Your driver." She shook her head. "No." She stepped closer and said, "You were the first person who saw me without seeing my money." I didn't know what to say. She continued, "And that was the first time in years I felt like someone actually saw me. I finally understood why our story had happened the way it did. Claire hadn't fallen in love with the man who drove her expensive car. She had fallen in love with the man who listened when she needed someone to listen. The man who didn't care about her bank account. The man who didn't ask what she could do for him. And I hadn't fallen in love with a wealthy woman. I had fallen in love with the person sitting behind the public image. The woman who could control a boardroom, but sometimes didn't know where she wanted to go after midnight. The woman who had everything except the one thing money couldn't guarantee. Someone she could completely trust. Looking back, the strange part isn't that Claire Whitmore fell in love with her driver. The strange part is that neither of us was looking for love when we met. She was trying to protect her company. I was simply trying to earn a living. She needed someone she could trust behind the wheel. I needed a job. Neither of us knew that the quiet drives, the long conversations, and the secret share between two people in a car would eventually change both our lives. What started as an employer and employee relationship became friendship. Friendship became trust. Trust became love. And love forced both of us to confront everything we thought we knew about money, status, loyalty, and what it really means to choose someone. Today, whenever Claire gets into my car, she no longer sits in the back seat. She sits beside me. Sometimes we talk for hours. Sometimes we drive in silence. Sometimes she still asks me to take the long way home, just like she did when we first met. And whenever she does, I know exactly what she means. She isn't asking me to get her somewhere. She's asking for a little more time together. Because after everything we survived, neither of us takes that time for granted anymore. I used to believe my job was to drive people from one place to another. Claire taught me that sometimes the person sitting beside you can completely change the destination of your life. I was just her driver. At least, that's what I thought when she first opened that car door. I thought I knew my place. I thought there were lines people like us weren't supposed to cross. But life doesn't always care about the lines we draw. Sometimes the person you least expect becomes the person you can't imagine living without. And sometimes the greatest love story begins in the most ordinary place, with one person behind the wheel and another person sitting quietly in the back seat. Before we end this story, let me ask you something. If you were in Daniel's position, would you have walked away when Claire admitted she loved you, knowing how much wealth, power, and family pressure stood between you? Or would you have taken the chance and followed your heart? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts and your own experiences with unexpected love. And if this story kept you watching until the end, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join the story chamber. Because sometimes the most unforgettable stories begin with two people who never expected to meet.